written by Ken Shelton. It is regarding the facts and circumstances surrounding his time in the United States Marine Corps during World War II period. Paragraph. The Masonic Home High School on June the 1st, 1942. Brothers Ray and Walt had graduated ahead of me, and we were back down in the Dagonia Springs area. Keith and Parvin spent another year at the Indiana Masonic Home, and when Keith graduated that year, he and Parvin both came back to Dagonia Springs, and this is where we stayed until each of us went into the service. Ray was the first to go in, and he was with the Army Engineers. Walt then went into the Army and was with the 81st Wildcat Division, and in 1943 I joined the Marine Corps. It was a rather long procedure getting into the Marine Corps at the time, as the draft had rules and regulations that we had to follow. I had to wait until I was actually called by the draft board. Then I could only join either the Army or Navy, and of course I took the Navy with the understanding that I would have a choice of getting into the Marine Corps. After joining the Navy at Evansville, I was shipped to Indianapolis, where I was discharged from the Navy and signed into the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. From there, I went by train to Chicago and transferred over to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad for the trip across the nation to San Diego, California. It was about a 5-day and night trip, and I had never been on a train before, and it was amazing to see the desert and the mountains and things that I had often read about, but never seen. And when we pulled into San Diego, we were at the recruit depot. Better known as the Marine Boot Camp. Most of the boys that were in my platoon were about the same age as I was, and they were all very homesick, this being their first time away from home. That didn't happen to me because I had been 8 years in the orphanage, and I had no be homesick. Boot camp was tough, but it was doable. The Marine Corps' objective here was to get us through boot camp as quickly as possible, get 2 or 3 weeks of combat conditioning behind us, and ship out for the Pacific Islands. Paragraph. After boot camp, we got 10 days of mess duty, which was scrubbing tables and floors, cleaning the heads and the toilets, and doing general cleanup work of that nature. After that, we were given a 10-day leave, but told not to go home if we lived east of the Mississippi. But I did. I got a train ticket from San Diego to Los Angeles, and then straight into Chicago and down to Evansville. It took me 4 days to get home. I had 1 day at home and the rest of the time going back. I didn't mind the trip. I was feeling pretty wealthy. I had about $52 in my pocket as I got my first pay. When I went out there, I just had $3 half in my pocket, so I was really coming along good. Paragraph. Uncle Gene and Porter Cooper wanted to hear exactly what I'd been doing, and they felt that I'd probably been doing a lot of fighting and shooting and in a practice way, but I had done very little of this. We had a few days on the rifle range, and I could tell them about that, but mostly I had to just tell them about cleaning toilets and tables and scrubbing floors. I had my expert rifleman badge, and I could show them that, and that helped some. When I got back to the Marine Corps base at San Diego, I was sent to Oceanside, Camp Pendleton, and assigned to the paratroop battalion at the Santa Margarita Range, 10th Camp 2. We began combat conditioning and training for the Marine paratroops, and we're about 3 to 4 weeks into that training. helpful in the Pacific Islands. So I was placed in what they called an X-platoon for reassignment and shipped out for Hawaii. I recall that we left after dark, and we could feel the ship rolling beneath us. This was a new thing, as I'd never been on anything bigger than a rowboat. In a few days, we pulled into Pearl Harbor, and were taken to the big island of Hawaii, where we went into the mountains to Camp Tarawa and set up there for training. We used the island of Maui for our beachhead landing practice. At that time, I was assigned to a small unit called a joint, the second joint assault company, and we were to be assigned to any of the Marine regiments that might need us in the coming landings. At the time, we did not realize that we were training for hitting the island of Saipan in the Marianas. As we prepared to leave Hawaii, we had time for one huge barbecue, and there was calf roping, horseback riding, bucking horses, bucking steers, a regular rodeo, and we had all of the barbecued beef that we could handle. We had all of our amphibious tractors and ammunition, all combat materials loaded on 6 LSTs, such as the ones built in Evansville. We were going to ride those slow-moving vessels all the way to the Marianas. By that time, I knew that I had been assigned to the 6th Marines and would be going in the first wave on the island that we were to hit. And all we knew was that it would be Red Beach 2. We had not yet been given the name of the island. We had 3 days ahead of us to be tied up in Pearl, and I knew that Ray, my older brother, was at Schofield Barrack just across the bay from where we were tied up, and I asked for permission to visit him, and I was given 1 day and night off to get over there and visit and get back to the boat. and I was in a small boat, and a sailor was taking me across to the beach just below Schofield Barracks. Suddenly all 6 of those LSTs exploded and blew barrels of gasoline, ammunition, all tractor parts, everything all around us. But we escaped being hit and got into the beach. And Brother Ray had seen the tremendous explosion, and he and some buddies had run down, and they met me as I stepped out of the boat. We lost a great many of our assault troops in that explosion, and it has now been written up after all these years of secrecy, and they are calling it the second Pearl Harbor. They do not really know what caused the explosion, but suspected sabotage. I told Ray that we were leaving for some island within 3 days, and he said that he was also leaving with his outfit, probably to the same place. I told him to look for me on Red Beach 2. We got the LSTs replaced the following day, and they flew replacements in for the dead and wounded from the States, and we set sail exactly the time we had expected to. These LSTs, top speed is 8 knots, and you could about walk as fast as they went. It was pretty rough, just wobbling from side to side on that slow-moving LSTs, but we arrived at our destination, which turned out to be the island of Saipan. The date and time was daylight, June the 15th, 1944. We were circling before daylight, and we had gone down for a breakfast of steak and eggs, which was the usual breakfast served to the Marines before attacking the beach. At daylight, we were amazed to see thousands of ships all in all directions. It was amazing to know that we had that much power and had it here at the island of Saipan. We came out of the LSTs in amphibious tractors and began circling. The H hour would be 8 o'clock. I was with a crew of about 15 young Marines heading for the beach at Red Beach 2. Our job was to fight our way in as far as possible, find a protected area, and set up radio communications from ship to shore, and help in directing in the rest of the landing craft. They kept sending landing craft in until they finally secured the beaches and got their communications set up with replacement men. I was then assigned to the 18th Marines for a few days, and then later, as we moved on inland and up toward I was assigned to the 8th Marines, where I stayed for the duration of the war. The Japanese were always very proud of the city of Garapan, which was the capital city of the Marianas Islands. When we went through it, it was bombed to nothing but rubble and a few structures left standing. We went from there on to Marpee Point, which is the location that we witnessed the women and children being thrown off the cliffs and jumping off to their deaths on the rocks below. A few turned and started walking back through the lines toward Americans who had promised them safety and security. But most of these were shot down by their own Japanese troops rather than allow them to cross over into the American lines. It was here on Saipan that I became close friends with Bill Mallory from Slate Springs, Mississippi, and with Bernard McCormick, or Big Mac as we call him. He was from Superior, Wisconsin. Also, we had Jess Macias from Colorado, and Kenny Ashley from Eastern Kentucky. We got together whenever we had a few minutes off and chewed tobacco and had great conversations about what we were going to do when we got home. Period. A few days before the fight was over, I went back to the landing point on the beach where they had now set up some tents for medical attention to the wounded, and I was looking for a replacement rifle and was sitting beneath a coconut log where I had some protection, and I saw a man coming down the beach. He was checking over the dead Marines as he came. When he got closer, I could see that it was my big brother Ray. I hollered at him. I said, "What are you looking for, hoss?" He came running and said, "It's you I'm looking for. They told me you'd been killed on the beach the first day." I said, "No, they were mistaken on that. There was another Shelton boy on Red Beach too that was killed the first day, but it wasn't me." We had a jolly good time together for a few hours. Ray was working on the airport, which we had previously taken, and they were trying to get it in shape to bring planes in. He had a 6x6 truck with a machine gun mounted in the back. They were always working under fire. When I left him, I went back to the front lines until we secured the island and began a mop-up operation. During the mop-up, we got a little relief from the fighting. In the late evenings, we would set up the machine guns, string some barbed wire around the perimeter of the camp, and lay back and rest and chew tobacco and tell great stories to one another. Bill Mallory was called Bull, not because he was 6 feet 4 inches tall, but simply because he chewed Red Bull chewing tobacco. He would get that sent to him from his folks in Mississippi. McCormick went by the name of Big Mac. I was referred to as the horse thief, and still get my mail from these buddies that are still alive with address to Horse Thief Shelton. That name came from Honolulu, Japan, when we were having the training on the big King Ranch on the island of Hawaii. I had captured a horse out on the range and used him to haul my radio equipment and my gun. He was easily handled, and I just kept him and used him in our training exercises. I hated to have to leave him, but I had no way I could get him aboard ship, or I would have. Had to let him stay on the range. But anyway, I picked up that name Horse Thief just because of that. After clearing up Saipan, we began preparing for the invasion of the next island of Tinian, which was within sight of Saipan. Brother Ray was high up on the airport, and looking down, he said he could see our invasion boats landing on the beach at Tinian, and he said it looked like the island was exploding all over. The landing there was not too bad. The planes bombed ahead of us, and the ships were firing on the island too. We had a pretty good landing by bringing in one boat at a time at a little secluded place where the Japs had no idea that we would attempt to land. We ran into a couple of banzai attacks on Saipan and were again faced with those on Tinian. On Tinian, Bill Mallory got shot up pretty bad, and Bull was taken out aboard a hospital ship. He'd been shot through the hip by a Jap sniper. It was a few weeks later that he was able to come back to the 8th Marines. And when he walked into the camp, I announced to him that I had saved his chewing tobacco ration and had it ready for him. I had also saved his beer ration. When in the rest areas, we would get issued 2 cans of beer per day. So I had a pretty good stash set up for him when he got back. After Colonel Crow was shot up severely and had to be removed from the island of Saipan, Major Chamberlain took over as commander of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, and it was on Saipan and Tinian that I became his communications carrier. I also carried a 30 caliber carbine rifle, 45 pistol, and an SCR 300 radio. Major Chamberlain was continually out in the front lines checking the infantry companies and working with headquarters. He also was doing some work as forward observer and would call in airstrikes. And it was very important that he have communications with him at all times. Many times the telephone lines were cut, and we had to rely on the radios until they could be repaired. And one day we were expecting a banzai. It was about time, and we were getting very close to the end of the Tinian campaign. I had been out all day with Major Chamberlain, and we'd had a pretty rough day. We came back to the command post at about almost dark, and Major Chamberlain set up the machine guns, got them in place, and told everybody that they were expecting a banzai that night. He asked for volunteers to help run barbed wire around the camp, and it finally wound up that he and I did the job ourselves. He took one end of the stick and I took the other, and we went as far around the camp as we could. We could hear the Japs in the field below, and they were drinking sake and preparing to start the banzai. We could hear them yelling at the Marines. They would say such things as, "Bing Crosby is a son of bitchy. Babe Ruth, a son of bitchy too." They thought this was really making the Marines mad, but they were just having a big laugh over it. Later that night, almost in the morning, the banzai started, and the Japanese were piled up in front of our machine guns and our riflemen. They did break through the lines and had to be chased down, but most of them were killed right there in our command post. The next morning, the general came aboard, come running up the shoreline and up to the command post. He said, "Where is the battlefield?" And Major Chamberlain pointed to the piles of dead Japs. He said, "Right here, General." And he said, "My men are tired." The next day, the Major and I, with several other Marines, went over the cliffs on ropes and down to the caves below. We had a Japanese interpreter with us that was familiar with the area, and he was pointing out the caves that were still occupied by Japanese soldiers. Some had civilians in them also. My instructions were to make a map of these caves and to go out aboard a destroyer the following day and direct gunfire into the caves that we knew were occupied. The next day, I went out aboard a destroyer. I was filthy and dirty. My trousers were frayed almost to the knees. About the only good thing I had on was my yellow leggings and my field shoes. The captain of the ship gave orders for me to be taken below, cleaned up, and issued new clothing. I'll never forget that night. We actually had come out on board and watch a movie, and we had good food. I had been on sea rations now for over 90 days, and I was enjoying this little trip. They put me in a nice cot with a mattress and pillow, but I could not go to sleep. I crawled out of the bunk, lay down on the steel deck, put my pistol belt under my head, and slept beautifully the rest of the night. When I woke up, the sailors were ganged around laughing, but they had an idea what had happened. The next morning, the seas were quite rough, and we were laying 2 or 3 miles out. I could see the caves, and I knew from my map the ones that I needed to direct the shooting. I went over this with the gunners, and I wondered how they could ever expect to hit those caves that were now just nothing more than a pinhole in the side of the cliffs, and the sea as rough as it was. But the first cave that I picked out for them to shoot in, the first round hit the lip of the top lip of the cave. The gunner quickly repositioned the ship and fired a second round that went directly into the mouth of the cave and exploded inside. This went on until we had totally destroyed the caves that held the enemy. The gunnery sergeant took me below decks to the ship's stores and told me before I left that I could have about anything I wanted out of there to take with me. They fully expected me to get a box of candy or some such thing as that, but I chose little box of Navy Star chewing tobacco. This brought a laugh from the sailors, but I got what I asked for. When I walked back in to the 8th Marine Regimental Headquarters, I was a hero to Bull Mallory and Kenny Ashley, not because of shooting into the caves, but because of the tobacco that I brought back. After the securing of the island of Tinian, the 2nd Marine Division returned to our rest camp on Saipan, and prepared to start training for another landing. By this time, the B-29s were beginning to land on Saipan and the airfield on Tinian, and were beginning round-the-clock bombing on Tokyo. When we returned to Saipan, I did not get to see Brother Ray again, as his outfit had completed their job on the airfield and had departed for parts unknown. Ray and I did get the word while we were together on Saipan that Brother Walt had been severely wounded at the island of Peleliu. A sniper's .31 caliber bullet had gone through his hip, hit his cartridge belt buckle, glanced upward, and literally ripped his guts out. His intestines were not damaged. He was only gutted like you'd gut a deer. One of his buddies got to him and shoved his intestines back in the cavity and wrapped his dungaree jacket around him, tied it, and hollered for the medics to come after him. He was taken aboard a hospital ship, and after about a month, he was notified that he could take the next plane for Hawaii and then on back to the States. Walt refused this. He said he wanted to stay with his 81st Infantry, and that he felt like he could do it, and that he had brothers out there in the Pacific Islands, and he didn't want to leave until they were ready to leave. By this time, we began getting some mail in from home, and I learned that after Keith's graduation, he had joined the Marine Corps and was somewhere in the Pacific. In checking with some of the other Marines, I found that he was in the 3rd Regiment of the 3rd Marine Division and was presently engaged in combat on the island of Guam, which was also in the Marianas group. Guam was approximately 1,000 miles south from Saipan. While we were in rest camp, I requested permission from the major to visit Keith on Guam. He was anxious to know how I expected to get there, and I told him that I could make arrangements with a pilot that flew mail in to the area and usually left Saipan and went directly to Guam. I had talked with this pilot before. The colonel gave me permission, or rather the major gave me permission, and I had learned that the 3rd Marines had pretty well mopped up the problems on Guam, and I caught the mail pilot and rode with him to the Agana airport in Guam. There I learned that the island was still not yet secure and that the 3rd Marines were still fighting on the tip end of the island. I could hear the sound of the guns, and I started walking in that direction. Feeling that the island was secure, I did not bring my rifle, but rather borrowed a .45 pistol from Big Mac McCormick, and that is all the protection I had. And as I was about halfway to the area where I could hear the Marine guns, I noticed coming toward me a weaving like of the weeds, like a dog or possibly a human crawling directly toward me. I assumed it was probably one of the Jap soldiers that had been left behind. I squatted down and pulled out the pistol. The weaving movements kept coming directly toward me, and I got the pistol positioned so that I could pop this fellow right between the horns when he came out of the weeds. When the weeds suddenly parted, and it was an old grandmotherly lady that was crawling in the weeds. Her daughter was in a cave back 300 or 400 yards from there and had been wounded. I could speak fairly well in the Japanese language, and I told her to get her daughter and to take her back up towards the airport, and she could get medical help and be taken care of. I holstered my pistol and kept on going. When I arrived at the command post of the 3rd Marines, I found that they were expecting a banzai that night and were preparing to possibly wipe out the remaining enemy troops. It was not hard to find Brother Keith. He was a machine gunner in the 3rd Regiment, and they pointed out to me where he was located. I was able to get an M1 rifle, and down to the location where Keith was sandbagging around his machine gun and preparing for the banzai, which was sure to come that night. I helped him with the sandbagging, and that night we lay in the sandbagged foxhole looking up at the sky. We noted that there was no Big Dipper or Little Dipper, only the Southern Cross. We discussed these stars, and we decided that we were on the bottom of the world, and we wondered why we didn't fall off. We got to laughing about such nonsense, and very shortly the little nips begin their yelling, and I'm sure they were getting juiced up on sake, and the banzai got underway. Keith was shooting approximately 200 yards where we could see the Japs coming through, and the banzai was short and sweet. They did not break the lines, but were pretty well totally destroyed. The 3rd Marines began pulling back the next day toward the airport. We spent most of our time going from one CB camp to the other and eating at their mess halls, where they had wonderful chow. I found that Keith had been chosen from the 3rd Marine Division to go back to the States, attend school at Villanova, and go for officers training. And I told him that I had been chosen from the 2nd Marine Division for the same exact deal, even to going to Villanova, and that I in fact had my sea bag packed and ready. A few days was spent with Keith, and then I returned to the Hagana airport and caught the plane back to Saipan. Keith's outfit began training for the landing on Iwo Jima, but Keith returned on to the States and out to Villanova. Upon my return to Saipan, the captain called me into his tent and advised that because of some incorrect material in my record book that I could not be returned to the States and to the Villanova school. But he told me not to unpack my sea bag, that the 2nd Marine Division would be tying in with the 5th Army and going to Okinawa for that invasion. We loaded on to the big APA troop ships, and in a few days found ourselves in the South China Sea in an apparent attempt to draw the remains of the Japanese Navy out of its homeland. We got caught up in a typhoon and had to sail rapidly out of the South China Sea and get as far out at sea to ride out the typhoon as we possibly could. We came out of this okay and prepared to invade the island. Just a short distance from the big island of Okinawa. The 8th Marines had the usual steak and egg breakfast, and we went into Ihayashima rather easily. Most of the troops had been removed from that island and taken on over to Okinawa to defend that. We loaded back on the APAs, and on Easter Sunday, 1945, we invaded the island of Okinawa. The 8th Marines were given a real easy situation, supposedly. We were to make a feint to the lower side of the island and actually go into the beach, but then return to our boats without actually invading that part of the island. This worked rather well. The rest of the 5th Army went in standing up with not much trouble. The only problem we all had was the kamikaze planes were in great droves, and they damaged the 8th Marines worse than a lot of beachheads that we had made. The Japs had withdrawn from the beach and decided not to fight the usual Actually, the Japs had decided to pull back inland and fight on the main part of the island rather than on the beaches as they had previously done. The 8th Marines did not get involved in this till much later paragraph. We had had a fairly interesting trip from Saipan to Guam, or rather from Saipan to Okinawa. We had been put aboard the big APAs, which were troop transports, and as we were sailing around in the South China Sea. We sat along the upper decks and sharpened our knives and bayonets, cleaned up our rifles, and passed the time away as much as possible, keeping everything clean and in order. I recall one evening as we were sitting along the rail that the announcement came over the loudspeaker that President Roosevelt had died. You could see tears in the eyes of many of the young Marines. We had never known any other president other than Franklin Roosevelt, and he was our commander-in-chief. It was a bad feeling to know that he had passed away and that we would be under other leadership. Paragraph. Once again, we were headed back toward Saipan, where we would go back to our tent camp and again start training for another mission, which we assumed would be the Japanese homeland. As we approached Saipan, we could see Mount Tapachau in the distance, and it brought back some bad memories of the first 2 or 3 days when we were invading the island. I recall a tremendous bombardment the first 3 or 4 nights, where the Japanese would shoot their mortars into the treetops, and they would explode over our heads. And when the volley was over, you would hear one of the groups call out that they had 10 dead and 20 wounded in their vicinity and needed help. And you begin to hear calls of this type all around. So we were not real eager to get back to Saipan, but it wasn't too bad. By now they had showers built where we could clean up and bathe. They even had a radio station set up. It was WXLD Saipan, just a stone's throw from Tokyo. We could listen to good stateside music if a radio was available to us. We built a basketball court and a volleyball court, and late in the evenings we would gather here and play ball and sit around, and those who smoked would smoke, and those that chewed tobacco would chew and spit. we were having a fairly decent time when we suddenly got a call to return to Okinawa that General Buckner had requested that the 8th Marines return. And to replace the 1st Marines, which had been badly shot up and were very tired as they had been there since day one. We landed below Naha town and moved up to the Shuri Mass Castle, where we began our march to the front lines. As we were moving up, the 1st Marine Division was moving back, and there was no joy, no fun as we passed one another. These boys were really worn out and badly shot up. We were beginning to meet some resistance, and the fight appeared to be about ready to get underway. And at that time we were just a little south and west of Shuri Mass Castle. We had one morning when the movement forward was rather slow and we were not having much trouble. We took a few minutes and dropped behind the lines and found a place where we could sit and rest, and Reverend Wickersham came back with us and had a wonderful church service. We had a mixed group. There were Protestants, Catholics, Jews. There were Indians who believed in the Great Spirit, and that was okay with us, as it was probably the same Great Spirit that we knew and prayed to. I recall that we had 2 Navajo Indians that were message center, and the Japanese could not understand their language, so they did much of the code talking that you read about. Reverend Wickersham did a noble job of bringing all of this group together and to the Lord in prayer. We were only there a few minutes till we were back into the front lines and organizing to move forward. By this time, Major Chamberlain had been promoted upward to the regimental headquarters, where he was more involved in the actual planning of the battles. I was now with Colonel Waldorf and was doing the same job that I did for Major Chamberlain. This particular morning, we were in the 8th Marine Regimental Command Post, which was on top of a rather high cliff, and the front lines were forming at the base of the cliff, preparing to cross a valley that stretched clear onto the other side of the island. And period. I was in the command post with Colonel Waldorf and Major Chamberlain when a man suddenly appeared in the command post. I'm not certain how he got there or just when, but it was General Buckner. He was real clean shaven and had on clean pressed khaki and was very impressive. The general spoke to all of us, and we understood that he was there to watch it. He referred to the 8th Marines as his 8th Marines, and he was there to watch them make the final drive across the island. Colonel Waldorf and I went down the cliff and joined the front ranks and began moving forward. We were catching a lot of small arms fire. We were stretched out on the ground to present as small a target as possible, and were looking desperately for the gun emplacements that were causing us much grief. Suddenly, a stream of bullets hit the ground right in front of my eyes, kicking sand into my face. I think the bullets came from our left flank, but I could not see a shooter. I jumped and ran to the right toward a brush pile, and Colonel Waldorf was right with me. We hit the deck and rolled in behind the brush pile, which seemed to be a place of safety right at the time. As we hunkered there, we heard a shell come over us, and it hit about 4 feet below the command post on the side of the cliff. Quickly, another shot came over, and we could see that it landed right in the command post. We could see their binoculars go in the air, and moments later I got a call on the colonel's radio stating that that last round killed General Buckner and injured Major Chamberlain. There were others in the command post, but I think the general was the only one that was killed. At this particular time, we continued moving forward. We're still catching a lot of rifle fire, and mortars were really tying up Easy Company. General or Colonel Waldorf headed straight for the heart of that battle with Easy Company. And as we approached the area, we saw Captain Barrett, who was in command of Easy Company, stand up, take off his helmet, and start walking off the battlefield just as though he were leaving a football game. He passed within a few feet of me, and I could see blood coming from his nose, his ears and mouth. He was undoubtedly in shock and probably had a bad concussion. I did not see him anymore and did not know what actually happened to him. About the same time that Captain Barrett came out, we saw two of the big Marines half dragging and pulling Top Sergeant Townley. He was badly wounded and finally got so that he could walk a little, and the two Marines helping him got him back to the rear. We did not see him anymore, and I do not know what happened as far as his wounds were concerned. I do know that Bo Mallory and I hated to see him go because he's the one that saved us the tobacco ration and kept us in chewing tobacco. Sergeant Townley was chewing and spitting that Navy Star tobacco juice when they drug him off the battlefield and passed me. We quickly stopped the action in Easy Company, shoved the Japs backwards, and captured the field pieces that had been used in killing General Buckner. The Japs were now on the run, and our troops were mowing them down. We pushed right on through to the ocean and ended all organized fighting on Okinawa. We still had a tremendous job of mop-up, but the organized fighting was over. We pitched our shelter halves and set up a temporary camp. We had located a real clean stream of water that ran to a waterfall with a rather deep hole at the bottom of the falls. Here we could bathe and wash our clothes and actually swim some. This was probably about a mile from our camp, and we tried to go there daily to clean up. Period, paragraph. Big Mac McCormick told us that he had heard that there was wild hogs on the island, and if we could get one, that he was a butcher by trade back in the States, and that he would clean and cut the hog up and cook it on an outdoor fire. We decided this was a pretty good idea, and we started back towards the river and the falls and took out across country, figuring if we couldn't find a hog that we would at least get a chance to swim under the falls. Approximately halfway on this excursion, we found a brush pile and saw a movement in that pile, and we of course had our minds on wild hogs, and we thought this was probably a hog in that brush pile, and we began to circle it with our rifles pointed in toward the center of the brush pile, when suddenly 4 Jap soldiers stood up. They had high explosives wrapped around their waist, and they put hand grenades to their waist. This blew their heads and shoulders higher than the Georgia pine. I'm sure that they saw us circling and thought we knew that they were in there. But if they'd have kept still, we probably would have moved on when we couldn't find any hogs. But anyway, they chose the way out. Anyway, we were so close to them that their blood and guts slapped us in the face and got our clothes in a terrible mess. So we continued on to the waterfall where we could clean up our clothes and ourselves. We returned to camp. We found that the 8th Marines were preparing to go back aboard ship and back to Saipan, where our tent camp was located and where we did our training for future operations. We figured the next move after we got to Saipan would be to prepare for the invasion of the Japanese homeland. When we got back to Saipan, we found that the big B-29 planes were already coming in daily to Saipan and to Tinian, and were pretty well keeping planes over Tokyo at all times. A few days later, it was announced that the U.S. had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and 2 or 3 days later dropped another on Nagasaki. The 2nd Marine Division was now being prepared to lead the invasion on the southern island of Kyushu into the city of Nagasaki. We were in the process of finishing up our tent camp on Saipan, and Beau Mallory was stringing telephone lines to the colonel's tent. He was wearing climbers and had climbed up into a coconut tree to string the wires, and he was testing the phones and listening in on the phones. I was sitting at the base of the tree chewing tobacco and holding my rifle across my knees. Mallory suddenly looked down and he said, "Horse thief, the war is over." I could tell by the way he said it that he wasn't kidding. Very quickly the word spread all over the island. And everybody was in a real happy mood. We could envision ourselves loading onto the ships, sailing to the foot of Broadway in San Diego, unloading on the docks, and meeting a crowd of cheering people. Period. This didn't happen. We were told to pack our sea bags, that we would be going the other direction. We would go to Japan for occupation duty and would be there until such time as enough green troops could be brought from the States to take over the occupation. I learned later that Walt's outfit, the 81st Wildcat Division, got the same deal that we got, only they went to the northern island of Hokkaido. By this time, Ray had been discharged and was home. Keith had been sent on to Villanova College and was in officers training. The 8th Marines landed at Nagasaki, and we went right into the heart of the city and were the first Marines to be there following the bomb. We were not told and had no idea that we might be getting into radiation from the atomic bomb. Apparently at that time no one knew what could happen. We stayed in Nagasaki a few days and then were shipped on what appeared to be a miniature railroad. It was just a very small train, just big enough to carry troops. Our next stop was Kumamoto, Japan, and that's where we were stationed. We had nice quarters in brick buildings with good cots and good meals. It was the first time in 4 years that we had seen anything like comfort. We had various duties here in the Kumamoto area. Some of us went on scouting parties looking for any kind of equipment, planes, ammunition, anything that might need to be destroyed. During the process of scouting the countryside, we went through a number of small villages. These villages were usually about 20 little huts built in a circle. Inside of the circle was just dust where the kids played and the women cooked in pots, much the same as our Indians did here many years ago. You could smell these little villages a mile before you got in sight of them. Also, as we went through the countryside, we would see the Japanese farmers waiting out in their rice paddies and doing other farming chores. And they would be plowing fields with old single shovel wooden plows and using oxen for power. This was like walking back through time. We saw lots of small gardens with all types of vegetables, much as we have here. There were fruit trees. The Japanese people referred to this fruit as a mikan. It was a lot like an orange, only more the size of a fruit such as an orange or possibly a tangerine. They called it a mikan. Some of the other Marines did guard duty around the camp and around various areas. On many days, we had no assignments and were allowed to get passes to go into the town of Kumamoto. Bill Mallory and I would get our shopping baskets, go by the PX and fill them with sugar and salt and pepper, shaving cream and soap, and other items that were impossible for the Japanese to get. We would go by the homes and restaurants and trade these to the Japanese people for the Rising Sun flag and other souvenirs, which we in turn sold to the new Marines and sailors that were coming in from the States almost daily. One weekend, about 100 of us were loaded into trucks and taken up a narrow mountain road about 20 miles up into the mountains. And there was a huge, beautiful hotel there. I recall that the hot water was piped in bamboo poles from a volcano high in the mountains. This hot water came into the hotel and was distributed through to bathing areas, and kitchen and other facilities. Also, cold water was piped in. They had a huge, beautiful dining room and a bar with all of the Japanese beer and sake that we could drink. The name of this huge rock hotel was Aso Konko. It's spelled ASO-KONKA. I believe that's KONKO. There were scenic trails that you could hike around on and see some wonderfully beautiful places. Bill Mallory and I spent most of our time hiking those trails, then coming back to the hotel and hunkering under a magnolia tree and chewing tobacco. We were there a couple of days and nights, and then went back to Kumamoto, and another truckload started up to the hotel to take their 2-day visit. I think all of the troops got to go through this before we were finally loaded and shipped back to the States. A month or so later, we were all out around camp and around the city of Nagasaki. That's around the city of Kumamoto. And we were having parties and enjoying the life. A lot of the boys were drinking lots of beer and sake, and we got word to return to our barracks and get ready to ship out for Sasebo, Japan. That's Sasabo, where we were to load aboard troop transports and head back to Hawaii. We got everyone together and were preparing to leave Kumamoto. The only person we couldn't find was our Navajo Indian code talker, Baldwin. Baldwin had, the last known to of him was that he had gotten fairly drunk and had stole a streetcar, and they were having a hard time catching him. We finally had to leave without him. I've often wondered what happened to him. He was a good friend of mine, and I've never heard from him since. I recall that one day in Kumamoto, Baldwin, McCormick, Macias, and Mallory were in a little restaurant, and they were waiting for me to show up. I had plans to meet them there, and they talked to the little Japanese waitress and taught her what to say when I came in. They told her it would be real polite and the thing for her to do. So when I came in and walked back to the table, she looked up at me and smiled and said, "Ken-san, a son of a bitchy." And of course those guys burst out laughing, and they figured they had a pretty good joke on me. Japanese pretty fluently, and those guys could just barely get by. So I was able to talk to the little lady and tell her what they had done, and she was embarrassed. I told her that they were all son of bitches, and that I was a great and wonderful young man. She smiled and let me know that she understood what we were talking about. These guys told this story all over Japan and aboard ship as we were returning. It never seemed to die out. As we were leaving Kumamoto, and I was preparing to pick up my sea bag and move out of the barracks, a boy from the Indiana Masonic home came in to relieve me. His name was Billy Kaufman. He was a red-headed boy and had been in Keith's class in the orphanage. I wonder what the chances are that that would happen. We set sail from Sasebo, Japan, about the 1st of December 1945, and were en route to Honolulu, where we would stop over for a day or two and then on to the States. Mallory and I were sitting out on deck, chewing that good Navy Star tobacco and talking. We were getting a little bit excited about going to be home in a few weeks. We wondered how we ever got into this situation. I told Bill that I didn't know what happened to him, but I could tell him how I got involved. On August the 31st, 1934, my dad and mother, Ray and Ruth Shelton, were killed in an automobile accident, and us 5 brothers were taken to the Indiana Masonic Home Orphanage. I was 10 years old. Here I sit now, and I'm 22 years old, and finally going to be able to go home. When I graduated from the Masonic home, I was 17 years old and anxious to get into the fight that was raging in the Pacific and in Europe. I did not know where I would be sent, but I joined the Marines and wound up in the Pacific, as did all of my other brothers. Parvin did not make World War II, but was in the tank corps throughout Korea. Our cousin Eugene Shelton, who was the only other Shelton in the family, the 6 of us all did duty in the Pacific. Parvin and Eugene in Korea, and the rest of us in World War II. Mallory was from down in Mississippi. He did not have any brothers, but he had sisters. Mallory, like myself, did not hardly know what to think about us being aboard this big, luxurious liner, the USS Admiral Paps. And actually, heading in the direction of home on December the 25th, or Christmas Eve of December the 25th, we pulled into the foot of Broadway at San Diego, and then were instructed not to unload, but they pulled back 20 miles at sea. The word had come through from Washington that we should not be unloaded until we had been rehabilitated. So we had a couple of weeks of schooling aboard ship. Then we went to a camp in the mountains of California and had classes there on rehabilitation. I can tell you for sure that we did not need to be rehabilitated. We needed to be sent home. That's where we all wanted to go. And we all knew the difference in killing the enemy and in killing our home people. This was a bit ridiculous, but it happened. We were not to realize the dancing in the streets that had previously taken place after the European War and after the Pacific War, but we were to be taken directly to Mayor Island, where we would be discharged and sent separately on our way to our homes, and that would scatter us all over the nation. I did not see Mallory again for almost a year, until one day that Keith and I showed up down at his grandparents' plantation near Slate Springs, Mississippi. We got out of our car, unloaded the bird dog and our guns, and looked up Bill and his Uncle Noel, and we took off hunting. We made this a yearly visit. Either Bill and Dot would come up and hunt with me, or I would go down into Mississippi and take Neva and the kids and hunt with Bill down there. We have carried this on for years. I was discharged from the Marine Corps on January the 16th, 1946, and came straight on home from Los Angeles with my uncle and aunt, Walter Hanson and Lula Hanson. They drove me I drove them in their car from Los Angeles to our home in Warwick County, where I would be staying with my grandpappy and grandmammy. The veterans of foreign wars contacted me and asked if I would be willing to escort the bodies of some of the dead Marines that were being shipped from Tarawa and Saipan back to the Warwick County area. I agreed to do this. I remember one case in particular. The body inside the casket was that of one of the Ingram boys from Folsomville, Indiana. When the service started, I stood at parade rest at the head of the casket, trying to make no movement, not even bat an eye through the service. Near the end of the service, I began thinking and wondering, was this worth it to put in those years in the Marine Corps, in the Pacific? I could have been home on the farm, but I recalled in my mind that I chose to join the Marine Corps. And I'm still wondering if it was worthwhile. Suddenly, an old lady stood up. She was small and obviously the grandmother of the Ingram boys. She hollered loudly, "God bless the Marines." A chill went up my back, and I immediately thought, yes, it was worth it. And I was proud that I had served with the Marines. And was very proud to have been chosen as an escort for this young Marine that had given his life a half a world away from where we were now. As I was leaving the church, I spotted a young girl from Dagonia Springs that I had been talking with on several occasions. It was Neva June Byers. I asked her why she had come up there. She said she just simply liked my dress blues. 20 years later, our son, Ken II, was wearing those dress blues and was in the Marine Air Wing and was stationed at Jacksonville, Florida. Our daughter, Marla Shawn, was in a private school, the Golden Hills Academy at Ocala, Florida. Neva and I continued to live here at Ash Iron Springs, and the children finally came back after graduation and after being discharged from the Marine Corps. My beautiful little wife passed away on February the 3rd, 2007. It's hard for me to hack the course without Neva here to help me. But this old leatherneck, in spite of his age and failing eyesight, is still capable of building a campfire daily, or almost daily, and whenever the weather permits, and sit around around that campfire, chew red man tobacco, and spit in the fire. Sometimes it seems that I can see her in the smoke of my campfires. Levi and I have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, nephews and nieces that all live within a stone's throw of our campfire. They usually all gang around the fire at night, and it's wonderful to have a family like we have. It's wonderful to have a big family like this, and one that in which we can sit around and talk and laugh and think about fun things rather than serious problems. Paragraph. I have tried to stay away from talking too much about the terrible, gruesome deaths of our buddies and the horrible deaths of the enemy. You can see all of this on television, as there are actual films of all of these islands that I have mentioned. Also, the magazines are full of this. I have a few stories that I have told the family over and over in the past years, and I'm sure they're tired of hearing some of these. But I recall one of the beachhead landings where I leaped out of the amphibious tractor and dropped 10 feet into the sand, and about 3 nips were making a run for the jungle trying to get off the beach. I had to shoot my way around them, and I ran on around to the other side of the amphibious tractor and dove into a shell hole. There was a big Marine sitting with his back against a rock in the bottom of that hole. His legs were off at slightly above the knees, and he was very conscious and not bleeding too badly. I went up to him and he asked me for a cigarette. I had to tell him that I would have to apologize and that I was sorry, but I didn't smoke and did not have one for him. About that time, one of the Navy corpsmen dropped into the hole and began the necessary treatment on this wounded man. These Navy corpsmen were actually trained with the Marines and wore Marine uniforms. Every one of them was called Doc, and they were good. They were excellent first aid men and very brave. They were continually working under fire and pulling the wounded off the battlefield and treating them under fire. You will never talk with an actual fighting Marine that will not tell you how proud he was to have the Navy corpsmen with them when they were in combat. Gunga I think of our buddy Big Mac McCormick. The poem goes like this. You can talk of gin and beer when you're quartered safe out here, and you're sent to penny fights and Aldershot. But when it comes to slaughter, you will do your work on water, and you'll lick the bloody boots of them that's got it. But not B.A. McCormick, Big Mac. Big Mac would choose the alcohol over water any time. He seemed to always have beer or sake or some kind of alcoholic drink, which would even include torpedo juice that he had learned to make when he was aboard the hospital ship. I remember coming in late one evening off the front lines, tired and terrible thirsty. Water was hard to come by on these islands. My canteen was empty. McCormick came over where I was standing and pitched me his canteen. He'd been there in the message center all day. I took a quick drink out of that canteen, and I thought I would most surely die. It was torpedo juice. I tried to gag it up, but couldn't. McCormick got a tremendous kick out of this at my expense. Paragraph. When we were in Japan on occupation duty, often we would go in downtown Kumamoto and go into what we would over here call a restaurant. There it was just simply a home where they would cook and serve you right in their home. I recall one place in particular where we would go in, and there was a large crock-like pot sitting in the center of the floor with a grill on top, and they would charcoal fish and other types of food, mostly fish, and there would be another bowl of fried rice. And they would serve us small orders of the brown rice with a fish on top of it, and it was really excellent. The fish were real small, and I do not know what kind of fish they were, but they were out of the ocean. When serving us, they would have a teacup full of hot sake, much as we would have hot tea. You did not want to drink this too fast, but only sip along with it while eating your fish heads and rice. usually after lunch, Mallory would want to go by a barber shop and get a shave. He would actually allow those Japs to shave him with a straight razor. But that was in order that I would be sitting right across from him with my rifle and keeping close guard on the barber. Myself, I was not interested in getting that close to one of the enemy with a razor in his hand. I can think of many things that happened when we were not in actual combat, but I've about run to the end of my story. After the war was over and all of the Sheltons had returned to their homes in southern Indiana, we took up the ways of the Indian tribes after their fight with the whites was over. And Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indians spoke to the white chiefs, stating, "From where the sun now stands, we will fight no more forever."
Testing 1 2 3 testing. Testing 1 2 3 testing. Testing 1 2 3 testing. Two buttons go in.
Well, I won't be recording ever.
No. But I mean that shows you what it is.
I'm recording in a business meeting. Testing 1 2 3 testing.